2025 became the turning point of this war. Russia's losses at the front surpassed 1 million soldiers. The economy, instead of slow growth, began to decline for the first time.
It can now be described as terminal.
Oil revenues also began to fall sharply for the first time. Western sanctions finally produced real results. India and China cut back purchases of Russian energy resources.
I didn't even understand what was happening.
Ukraine expanded its long-range weapons and began striking Russian oil refineries, oil terminals, and military facilities. How did Russia exhaust its reserve of resilience this year? How much longer can it continue the war? And can Putin be stopped in the near future? Watch in the special report, Russia 2025, the aggressor on the brink of collapse. This photo captures the situation Russia found itself in 2025. A mobile fire group near the Kremlin, waiting for Ukrainian drones to arrive. This year, the war fully moved onto Russian territory. And this is no longer limited to border regions. Strikes hit almost the entire country. Ukraine scaled up drone and missile production and began hitting targets deep inside the aggressor state. Ammunition depots, military industrial facilities, oil refineries ignited one after another. Syzran oil refinery, Volgograd oil refinery, Saratov oil refinery, Ryazan oil refinery. This is the Novoshakhtinsk oil refinery. It burned for 5 days. Drones reached the refinery in Orsk, 1,500 kilometers from the front line, and in 2 men, 2,000 kilometers away. In total, 15 major oil refineries were struck this year. There are only 30 in Russia. A fuel shortage began in the so-called gas station country. That also reduced the capabilities of Putin's army, because oil is the blood of war. The Ukrainian armed forces also struck oil transportation routes to cut Russian exports as much as possible, to drive down revenues that fund the war. Ukraine delivered painful strikes on pipelines, pumping stations, and oil terminals used by the Shadow Fleet. Tuapse, Novorossiysk, Uсть-Luga. This entire infrastructure is a weak point of the Putin regime.
This is Russia's Achilles heel. These nodes are where everything converges. Oil is the country's main export and its primary source of income. And there are only a handful of ports and pumping stations. These are critical choke points. Hit them, and the impact is immediate and severe.
These strikes are already being called Ukrainian kinetic, or explosive sanctions. At the end of November, Russia was hit by sanctions from Donald Trump as well. The US administration imposed tough restrictions on Russia's 2 largest oil companies, Rosneft and Lukoil.
The main source of Russia's war financing is oil and global oil exports. They chose to strike this weak spot. Unlike Biden, who imposed oil sanctions but avoided the 2 largest companies, Trump went further.
As a result, even Russia's biggest importers, China and India, sharply reduced purchases of Russian oil.
How deep was the drop in India's imports of Russian oil? Analysts now predict that in January, India's purchases could be 4 times lower than just a few months earlier. This is a massive decline.
China and India are buying not only less, but at lower prices. Fully aware of Russia's lack of alternatives, Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi are twisting Putin's arm demanding steep discounts. The discount reached $20 per barrel.
These are enormous losses for Russia's budget and for revenue from oil sales. And that directly reduces Russia's ability to continue a war of this scale against Ukraine.
The massive hole in Russia's budget has grown even larger. Putin's confused and frightened expression on the day Trump imposed sanctions says more than 1,000 of the dictator's words. The restrictions are working.
I didn't even understand what was happening.
The outgoing year turned out to be disastrous for the Kremlin. Revenue from oil and gas sales fell by 35%. This is the hardest blow to Russia's economy since the start of the war.
Russia will lose roughly $50 billion in budget revenue. That is 1/3 of its total war spending. Putin can no longer bluff. He can no longer go out and claim growth, claim that everything is fine. These are real problems now, followed by systemic crisis.
This is Russia's national wealth fund, Putin's personal stash. Billions were poured into it when Russia sold oil and gas at high prices and in huge volumes. During the first 3 years of the full-scale war, Russia actively burned through these reserves. It used them to plug budget holes and pretend everything was under control. That sanctions did not matter. But in 2025, the fund is almost empty. About 3 trillion rubles in liquid assets remain. At the scale of a state, that is nothing. Russia's budget deficit is far larger, over 5 trillion rubles. This stash is not even enough to cover it. And in any case, the remaining funds will not be used to patch holes.
Putin is afraid to be left completely without this money. If he ever needs to run, this is where he plans to take it from. He needs $10 or $20 billion for a black day, and that black day is approaching.
Russia's economy is collapsing fast. For the first time since the war began, it stopped growing. Even Rostat's numbers, usually polished and embellished, show GDP growth close to zero. The country has officially entered stagnation. This was stated by the head of Sberbank, German Gref.
We see it in GDP growth rates. Industrial growth can be described as stagnation.
Putin refused to believe it until the very end.
German Gref says the Russian economy is stagnating. Do you agree?
No.
While Putin denied reality, the economy moved from stagnation into recession, into decline. Industry across the board began to fall. Coal mines in Kuzbass are effectively bankrupt. Aircraft production dropped by 10%. Furniture manufacturing fell by 10%. Clothing production by 5%. The food industry is also in recession. This year, for the first time in 15 years, food production declined. In simple terms, Russians are eating less. Declines are also seen in metallurgy, woodworking, construction. The list goes on. It is easier to name what is not declining in Russia: missiles and drones. Everything else is deep in the red. Russians are getting poorer every day. So what did the Kremlin do when reserves ran dry and the economy went into free fall? It began urgently raising taxes to squeeze out whatever money it still could. From next year, value-added tax will increase from 20 to 22%. That means higher prices across the board for all goods, for all services. Companies cannot afford to pay salaries. To avoid mass layoffs and a spike in unemployment, businesses switched to a 4-day work week. This affected small businesses and major corporations alike. Avtovaz, steel plants, even the railways. This year, Russia also sharply accelerated money creation. The central bank effectively turned on the printing presses. flooding commercial banks with loans. At the same time, the finance ministry churned out government bonds at scale. This too is money printing. The result is stark. Russia's money supply has doubled compared to the period before the full-scale invasion. Twice as many rubles in circulation, but far fewer goods than before the war. This means those freshly printed rubles will buy less and less. The country is heading toward runaway inflation. Food, utilities, medicine, and other basic necessities are set to rise by tens of percent. Independent economists describe the state of Russia's economy with one word: catastrophe. But the authorities pretend everything is under control. They invent euphemisms. It is not a recession, not a collapse, cooling.
This will lead to cooling of the economy.
Our decisions led to cooling.
Economic cooling.
We are talking about gradual cooling.
They repeat this word like a mantra. Even Putin's supporters and advocates of the war are losing patience.
So what is it now, cooling or recession? Everyone knows what recession is, but what is cooling? Cooling or recession?
You know, we are entering a cold spell.
But such clumsy euphemisms are used only by officials. Russian industrialists, driven by desperation, call things by their real names.
The situation in the economy as a whole can be described as effectively terminal.
The Kremlin is merely delaying death, the collapse of the economy, by selling its energy resources for next to nothing: gas, oil, coal, to China. This year showed that Putin has finally become a vassal of Xi Jinping.
Russia is now completely dependent on China. Its military industry, its industrial base, its business sector all rely on Beijing. China could pull the plug, and Russia would collapse like a house of cards. This dependence is not only economic, it is geopolitical.
Putin is destroying his own country. Russia is losing sovereignty, all to get money for the war. A very, very expensive war. In 2025, the daily cost of the war reached almost $1 billion. Military spending in Russia exceeded 40% of the entire state budget. Nearly half of all national funds go toward producing shells and armored vehicles that burn almost immediately at the front, toward luring Russians with signing bonuses, and then, weeks later, paying death benefits to their families. By mid-year, Russian army losses exceeded 1 million. By the end of December, they reached 1.2 million. At least 300,000 killed or dead from wounds. The rest disabled.
This is a colossal blow, and Russians themselves were forced to admit they were not prepared for losses on this scale. Losses exceed the Army's ability to replenish manpower. This is an enormous problem facing the Russian military.
This trend began precisely in 2025. More soldiers are dying than new ones are arriving. On one side, around 1,000 people are killed every day. On the other, fewer and fewer people are signing contracts for the so-called special military operation. People understand that no amount of money, 1 million rubles or two, can be taken into a coffin. New contract soldiers are immediately thrown into meat assaults to slaughter. What is happening inside the Russian army is increasingly leaking out. Soldiers record it on their phones. Those who refuse to go to certain death are thrown into pits, kept there for days, naked, cold, wet, without food or water, until they break and reach the fatal conclusion that dying from Ukrainian drones is better than rotting in a pit. Even the wounded are sent into assaults, on crutches. Russian commanders treat their soldiers as expendable material. That is why the losses are so massive. Fields along the front line are literally covered with the bodies of Russian soldiers. But for Putin, these are merely unavoidable costs. His cynicism toward the war and toward dead Russians shocked even many pro-war bloggers when he called the so-called special military operation a hustle.
When everything is calm, we get bored, we want some action. Then the action starts. Everything whistles past your head. Bullets, horror, but not full-on horror.
More than 1 million killed and maimed. Hospitals filled with Russians without arms and legs. Cemeteries expanding at enormous speed. Their scale can no longer be grasped with the naked eye. It can only be measured by satellite images. And even then, there is not enough space. Cemeteries keep expanding. Forests are cut down to make room. Planes cannot keep up with transporting the dead back to Russia.
Кошмар. Очень большая партия пришла. 2 борта. По 2 самолета стали отправлять.
But for Putin, all of this is not
horror, horror, horror. Everything is measured in economics.
What does the economy have to do with it? Everything is simple. Putin believes he still has enough money to buy people and throw them by the tens of thousands into meat assaults. That Russia still has enough people willing to die out of poverty and hopelessness. The dictator is betting on a war of attrition. He hopes Ukraine will break, that the United States under Donald Trump will step aside, that Europe will abandon Ukraine. But everything turned out differently. At the beginning of the year, Trump announced that the United States would no longer supply Kyiv with weapons and ammunition for free in the same volumes. But European countries can buy everything Ukraine needs from the United States.
We are going to be sending them weapons and they're going to be paying for them. The United States will not be having any payment made.
As a result, European countries purchased $5 billion worth of weapons from the United States this year and transferred them to Ukraine. A special financing program was launched for this purpose, Pearl. Under this program, Europe will continue purchasing primarily those weapons that are not produced in Ukraine or in the EU. For example, Patriot air defense systems. Putin's hopes failed. Even though U.S. assistance decreased, European support increased significantly. It did not fully compensate for the reduction in American supplies, but EU leaders clearly stated they will continue increasing support for Ukraine because the security of the entire European Union depends on it.
If we all agree that Ukraine is our first line of defense, we have to step up the military support for Ukraine.
Europe already has to defend itself from Kremlin aggression. Putin is waging a hybrid war against the EU. At the beginning of the year, tankers from Russia's Shadow Fleet repeatedly damaged underwater infrastructure in the Baltic Sea, gas pipelines, internet cables. Inside EU countries, agents of Russian intelligence services carried out arson and sabotage. In the autumn of 2025, Russia moved to the next step. It began launching drones into EU countries. Putin's drones crossed into Polish airspace. Presumed Russian UAVs were also detected over Romania, Lithuania, Estonia, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Germany, Belgium, and France. In November 2025, seeing no firm response, Putin decided to push even further. Russian intelligence services organized an explosion on a railway line in Poland, between Warsaw and Lublin. A catastrophe was narrowly avoided. A passenger train could have derailed. Dozens could have been injured or killed. But hybrid war is only preparation. Putin is planning an invasion of EU countries. He is restrained only because all his forces are tied down in Ukraine. This was stated by EU Defense Commissioner Andrius Kubilius and EU High Representative Kaja Kallas. The same conclusions were reached by Danish and German intelligence services. They warned that Russia could be ready for an attack in approximately 3 years.
2029 is the moment when Russia could wage a large-scale war, including a possible attack on NATO territory. We see how Putin's intentions, his weapons, and his manpower converge toward this date.
Even Putin himself is barely hiding his intention to wage war against Europe anymore. The threats are now explicit.
We are ready right now.
This year, European countries increased defense spending. The EU approved a 150 billion euro lending mechanism. The money will go toward weapons production and procurement.
This is vital, catastrophically vital for Europe's survival. And it is not enough.
It is not enough because the United States plans to gradually withdraw its troops from Europe. And it already took the first step by reducing its contingent in Romania. The European Union can no longer fully rely on US protection in the event of a Russian attack.
Europe today needs an enormous injection into its military-industrial complex to prepare for a US withdrawal from the continent. If Trump follows through on what he says, what will Europe do? It will be completely exposed and defenseless, even with increased budgets. In this situation, Ukraine is just as vital for Europe as increased defense spending. Ukraine is the only country on the European continent that knows what war is, how to fight, how to survive, and who Russia really is, with all its strengths and weaknesses.
Ukraine showed how to defeat Russia with its Operation Spiderweb deep in the aggressor's rear. On June 1st, SBU drones attacked Russian strategic bombers, two 95 and two 22 M3 aircraft capable of carrying nuclear missiles. A total of 41 aircraft were hit. That is 34% of all strategic cruise missile carriers. Russia's losses reached $7 billion.
This is also a devastating economic blow to the Russian Federation. The number of aircraft destroyed by Ukrainian intelligence is something Russia simply cannot replace. It lacks the capacity to rebuild them, bring them back into service, or restore full combat readiness. What was lost is not just hardware. This is an unprecedented strike against one of the core components of the occupier's nuclear triad, a level of damage Russia has never faced before.
Operation Spiderweb was conducted simultaneously in Murmansk and Irkutsk regions, thousands of kilometers from the front line. The security service of Ukraine secretly delivered FPV drones closer to airfields using rented trucks. Agents operated directly inside Russia. The mission required extraordinary ingenuity, coordination, and courage.
This was a unique operation. There is no doubt it will be studied in detail by the intelligence services of Ukraine's strategic partners.
Throughout the year, Russia continued mass terror against Ukrainian civilians. Missile and drone strikes on densely populated residential areas. To kill and maim as many civilians as possible, Russia modified its Shahed drones. They were equipped with shrapnel and delayed action cluster munitions. Small, lethal fragments scatter up to 100 meters in all directions.
This is used to kill people. This is genocide.
Unexploded submunitions turn strike sites into minefields. In the early years of the full-scale war, Kremlin propaganda lied, claiming Russia tried to avoid civilian casualties. This year, the masks came off. Propaganda now openly calls for genocide, echoing Nazi rhetoric.
The Kyiv dam must be destroyed. The city must be flooded. Kharkiv must be destroyed. Mykolaiv, Odessa, Sumy, erased from the map. Like Dnipro and other cities, there's only one way to fight a war.
Cities near the front line are indeed being erased. Russia uses guided aerial bombs on a massive scale. They can destroy entire apartment blocks. Civilians die under collapsing concrete, including children. This year, Russia increased the range of these bombs. They can now reach Kharkiv. Its densely populated neighborhoods are subjected to devastating bombardment. Russia also began mass terror using FPV drones. FPV means first-person view. The drone operator sees the target live, in real time, through the camera. Russian operators watch exactly who they are attacking, and they are killing civilians deliberately, including women and children. In the village of Pravdine, in the Kherson region, a Russian drone killed a 1-year-old child playing in a playpen in the yard of a private home.
It dropped lower. The wings were visible and the sound was terrifying. Then the blast hit and everything scattered. A fragment went straight into his heart, shattered his lungs. They saw the child. There was a stroller here and another one over there.
Teenagers are also targeted. A Russian drone dropped explosives on 13-year-old Ilya from Kherson. He suffered injuries to his arms and legs.
It saw me run behind a tree and drop the charge. It hovered above me for about 10 seconds.
This year, Russia significantly intensified terror. The number of civilians killed and seriously wounded in 2025 far exceeds previous years. This is part of Putin's strategy.
This is an attempt to break us from within, to crush resistance behind the front lines. Putin cannot win on the battlefield, so he is trying to destroy Ukraine from the inside. He understands that this war cannot be won by conventional means, so he targets the core of Ukrainian resistance, the will to endure, and the ability of Ukrainian society to survive under the conditions of war.
But Putin is getting the opposite result. All public opinion polls in Ukraine this year, as in previous years, show the same result. An overwhelming majority supports continued resistance and will not agree to capitulation to Russia in any form.
For us, this is an existential war. Like steel. You can bend it, you can strike it, but resistance only grows stronger.
Nearly 4 years of full-scale war are behind us. The Ukrainian army continues its heroic fight. Russia suffers colossal losses in people, in equipment. Its economy is collapsing. Putin is killing his own country, leading it toward ruin.
I call Putin a necrocrat. Dead power. He is already dead. A dead leader ruling a dead government, a dead Kremlin, walking corpses, still capable of killing and causing harm.
And as long as the Kremlin dictator has even the slightest ability to continue the war, he will not stop. He can only be forced to stop by increasing pressure on Russia, by placing it before a choice: peace or total collapse. This requires enforcing existing sanctions and continued support for Ukraine, for its armed forces, so they can fully apply their kinetic sanctions. 2025 truly became a turning point in this war. For the first time, all the conditions for its end have emerged. Russia has weakened enough. The Ukrainian army has grown strong enough. And if support for Ukraine increases and pressure on the Kremlin continues, the next year may bring what millions have been waiting for: an end to the war and a long-awaited peace. Maxim Orlapov, Special Report.